My name is Lauren Mitchell. I am 34 years old and 3 weeks after my mother died. I came home to discover that the only place in the world I still considered home had been put up for sale without my permission. I remember the exact moment I saw the sign. It was a cold Tuesday morning, and I had driven nearly 2 hours because I had received a strange message from my brother the night before. He had simply written, "We need to talk about Mom's house." There was no explanation, no details, and no answer when I called him. So I drove to Willow Creek Road expecting to find him waiting inside. Instead, I found a large white for sale sign planted in the front yard. My mother's blue curtains were still hanging in the windows. The old oak tree she had planted when I was 8 was still standing beside the driveway. The flower bed she had spent 20 years caring for was still there. But now a real estate sign stood in the middle of it, as if someone had decided that my mother's life could be reduced to a number on a listing website. I stopped my car and stared at it for several seconds. Then I saw my brother Daniel standing near the garage with a woman wearing a black blazer. She was holding a clipboard and speaking to him like he was already the owner. Daniel noticed me and smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile. It wasn't the smile of someone caught doing something wrong. It was a confident smile, almost arrogant, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. I walked toward them and asked, "Why is our house for sale?" Daniel looked at me and laughed softly. "Our house," he repeated. "Lauren, Mom left this place to me." I felt something inside me go completely still. No, she didn't. He reached into his car and pulled out a folder. "I have the paperwork." I looked at the folder, then back at him. "You mean the paperwork you created after she died?" The real estate agent immediately became uncomfortable. Daniel's smile vanished. "You should be careful what you accuse people of." I looked at the house behind him and remembered my mother's voice telling me that this place was more than walls and furniture. It was where my grandfather had taught her to cook. It was where she had brought Daniel home from the hospital. It was where I had taken my first steps, celebrated birthdays, graduated from college, and cried after my first heartbreak. And now my brother was standing in the driveway telling me that he owned it. What Daniel didn't know was that 2 days before my mother died, she had called me from her hospital bed and whispered 4 strange words that I had not understood at the time. "Check the old clock." I had almost forgotten those words, but standing in front of that for sale sign, I suddenly remembered every syllable. "5 years earlier, everything between Daniel and me had looked normal from the outside. My mother, Margaret Mitchell, lived alone in the same house on Willow Creek Road. I lived in the city about 40 minutes away and visited her almost every weekend. Daniel lived closer, but strangely enough I saw him less often. He was 6 years older than me and had always been the kind of person who could make every problem sound like an emergency. When his business needed money, Mom helped. When his car broke down, Mom helped. When his first marriage ended, Mom paid several months of his rent because he told her he needed time to get back on his feet. When he decided to start another business, she gave him money again. I never resented my mother for helping him. She was his mother and she loved him. But I slowly realized something uncomfortable. Daniel had learned that if he asked Mom for something with enough confidence, she would eventually give it to him. I was different. I had always been independent. I worked hard, paid my own bills, and rarely asked Mom for anything. Maybe that was why she trusted me with things Daniel never knew about. She would call me when she was worried. She would tell me when she was afraid. And sometimes she would say things about Daniel that she immediately regretted saying. Then she would ask me not to repeat them. 2 years before Mom died, she fell in the kitchen while reaching for a glass on the top shelf. She fractured her wrist and spent several days in the hospital. After that, she wasn't quite the same. She became slower and more cautious. She stopped driving at night. She needed help with groceries and medical appointments. I started rearranging my work schedule so I could visit more often. I took her to appointments, fixed small things around the house, handled the utility bills, and made sure she had food in the refrigerator. Daniel promised he would help. He always promised. But his promises rarely became actions. Whenever Mom asked him to come over, he had a meeting. Whenever I asked him to repair something, he was traveling. But the moment the conversation turned toward the house, Daniel suddenly became very interested. One afternoon, while Mom was sitting in her favorite chair, Daniel looked around the living room and casually asked, "How much do you think this place is worth now?" I looked at him and asked why he wanted to know. He shrugged and said he was only curious. Mom heard him and immediately said, "I'm not selling it." Daniel smiled and replied, "I didn't say you should." But there was something in his expression that bothered me. It wasn't curiosity. It looked like calculation. A few months later, Mom's health began declining faster. She started forgetting little things. Sometimes she would put her glasses in the refrigerator and then laugh about it. Other times she would ask me the same question 3 times within 10 minutes. But there were certain things she never forgot. She remembered birthdays. She remembered family arguments from 20 years earlier. She remembered every promise Daniel had ever made to her. One evening, while we were sitting together in the living room, she reached over and held my hand. "Lauren, promise me something." I smiled and said, "Anything." She looked at me seriously and said, "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting yourself." I laughed softly because I didn't understand why she was saying it. "Mom, what happened?" She looked toward the hallway and lowered her voice. "Sometimes the person who asks for the most is the person who believes you owe them the most." I immediately thought of Daniel. Before I could ask what she meant, the doorbell rang. Daniel walked inside carrying a leather briefcase and a smile that disappeared the moment he saw me. He told Mom he had brought some estate planning documents. I asked what they were. He said they were simple papers that would make everything easier later. I told him that if they were important, all of us should review them together. Daniel became angry. He accused me of not trusting him. He said I always assumed he was trying to take advantage of Mom. I told him I hadn't accused him of anything. But Mom refused to sign the documents. Daniel left that evening furious. Later that night, Mom called me into her bedroom. She was sitting beside an antique wooden clock that had belonged to my grandfather. She pointed at it and asked, "Do you remember this?" I smiled and said, "Of course. Grandpa built it." She nodded. "He used to hide important things inside it." I laughed. "Mom, you told me that when I was little. I thought it was just a story." She looked directly into my eyes. "No, Lauren. It wasn't a story." She opened the small lower cabinet of the clock. It was empty. Then she closed it and whispered, "Not yet." I didn't understand what she meant. I asked if something was wrong. She said no. I asked if Daniel had done something. She didn't answer. Instead, she told me that some things were safer when they remained hidden until the right person was ready to find them. At the time, I thought she was talking about family memories. I had no idea she was preparing me for what would happen after she died. 2 months later, Mom was hospitalized again. This time the doctors told us her condition was serious. I spent 5 nights sleeping in a chair beside her bed. Daniel visited once. He stayed for about 20 minutes and spent most of that time looking at his phone. Before leaving, he asked me a strange question. "Did Mom tell you anything about the house?" I looked at him and asked why he wanted to know. He said, "Because if something happens, we need to know what we're doing." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. He wasn't asking about Mom's health. He was asking about the house. I told him we would deal with everything legally when the time came. He looked annoyed. "You're not the only one who cares about her." I didn't respond. The next morning, Mom woke up and looked unusually peaceful. She reached for my hand. Her fingers were weak. She squeezed mine and whispered, "Check the old clock." I leaned closer and asked, "What?" She repeated, "The clock." I asked her what was inside. She smiled faintly and whispered, "Something your brother doesn't know about." Those were the last clear words my mother ever said to me. 3 days later, she died. The funeral passed in a blur. People came with flowers and condolences, but I barely heard what they were saying. I kept looking at the front of the room where Mom's photograph stood beside a candle. Daniel stood nearby wearing a dark suit. He looked sad when people were watching. But whenever no one was looking, his eyes kept drifting toward me. The day after the funeral, he called and said we needed to empty the house quickly. I told him we should wait until the estate was reviewed. He said there was no reason to wait. He wanted Mom's jewelry. He wanted her car. He wanted access to her financial records. I told him we should do everything properly. He became frustrated and said I was making everything difficult. 2 days later, he slammed a folder onto the kitchen table and said, "Mom left the house to me." I stared at him. "Where's the will?" He said the attorney had it. I asked which attorney. He paused. Then he said he would send me the information. He never did. Instead, he stopped answering my calls. A week later, I discovered that he had filed documents transferring the property into his name. I immediately hired an estate attorney named Rebecca Collins. She was calm, precise, and completely unimpressed by Daniel's paperwork. She reviewed the public records and asked me when my mother had supposedly signed the transfer documents. I gave her the date. Rebecca looked up at me. "Your mother was hospitalized that entire week, correct?" I nodded. She leaned back in her chair. "Then we have a serious problem." I asked what she meant. She explained that if Mom was physically incapable of signing or if the signature was forged, the transfer could be challenged. But she warned me not to confront Daniel until we knew exactly what we were dealing with. "If he believes you know nothing, he may make a mistake," she said. Those words stayed with me. I drove home that evening thinking about the old clock. Then I remembered Mom's final words. "Check the old clock." I drove to Willow Creek Road. Daniel had changed the locks, but I still had an old key Mom had given me years earlier. I wasn't sure if it would work. I put it into the lock and turned it. The door opened. The house was almost empty. Mom's furniture was gone. Her photographs were missing from the walls. Even her favorite chair had disappeared. It felt like someone had stripped the memories from the rooms. I walked slowly toward the bedroom. The antique clock was still hanging on the wall. My hands began shaking. I opened the lower cabinet. Nothing. I checked the back. Nothing. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood Mom. Then I remembered her saying, "Not yet." I took the clock off the wall and examined the wooden frame. There was a narrow panel behind it that I had never noticed. I ran my fingers across the wood and felt a tiny brass latch. Pressed it. A hidden compartment opened. Inside was a small envelope with my name written across it. "Lauren." I sat down on the floor. For several seconds I couldn't move. Then I opened it. The letter began with words that made my heart stop. "My dear Lauren, if you are reading this, then Daniel has probably tried to take control of the house." I read the sentence twice. My mother had known. She had expected this. She had planned for it. She explained that years earlier, my grandfather had placed the house into a protected family trust. The property could not be sold by one beneficiary without authorization from the trustee. The trustee was a retired attorney named Samuel Reed. She explained that Daniel had been told about the trust years earlier, but she suspected he had forgotten the details. Then she wrote something even more important. She said that the original copy of her will was also hidden inside the clock. I searched the compartment again and found a second envelope. Inside was the original document. My mother had left the house equally to Daniel and me, but there was a specific condition. Neither of us could sell, transfer, mortgage, or otherwise dispose of the property without the written consent of the other beneficiary. Daniel had no right to transfer the house into his name. He had no right to list it for sale. And he certainly had no right to tell a buyer that he was the sole owner. But Mom wasn't finished. She had left a separate note explaining why she had hidden the documents. She wrote that Daniel had become increasingly aggressive whenever the subject of the house came up. She feared that after her death, he would try to take control before the estate could be reviewed. She also wrote something that hurt more than anything else. "I love my son, but love does not mean ignoring what he is capable of doing." I sat on the bedroom floor with the letter in my hands and cried. My mother had been afraid of Daniel. She had known that I might need protection from my own brother. And somehow, despite being sick and frightened, she had still found a way to protect me. The next morning, Rebecca contacted Samuel Reed. He confirmed the trust immediately. He also told us something I had not expected. 6 weeks before Mom died, she had met him privately. She had asked him to record the meeting because she was worried about Daniel. Samuel sent us the recording. I listened to my mother's voice through my attorney's laptop. She sounded tired but determined. "If Daniel tries to sell the house after I die, I want Lauren to know that I never gave him permission." There was a long pause. Then Mom said, "I know my son. He will say he misunderstood. He will say he was trying to help. But if he takes this house, it won't be an accident. I covered my mouth with my hand. I wasn't crying because I had found evidence. I was crying because my mother had known what was coming and had been preparing for it while she was still alive. Daniel still had no idea what I had found. Rebecca told me not to confront him yet, so I waited. 2 days later, Daniel called me. His voice sounded cheerful. "Good news," he said. "I found a buyer." I remained silent. He continued talking about the offer. "Almost $600,000. I asked, "Have you signed anything?" He said, "Not yet." I replied, "Good." He became suspicious. "Why?" I said, "I just wanted to know." He laughed. "You finally accepted reality." I looked at the original will on my desk and said, "No, Daniel. I finally discovered it." There was silence. "What does that mean?" he asked. I smiled even though he couldn't see me. "You'll find out." Then I hung up. 3 days later, Daniel brought the potential buyer to the house. He thought he was about to finalize the sale. Instead, he walked into a room where I was sitting with Rebecca and Samuel Reed. The buyer, a middle-aged man named Thomas Gray, looked confused. Daniel stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" I placed the original will on the table. His face changed immediately. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "Mom." He stepped closer and stared at the document. "That's not real." Samuel Reed calmly said, "It is." Daniel looked at him. "Who are you?" Samuel replied, "The trustee." Daniel's face went completely pale. I pressed play on the recording. My mother's voice filled the room. "If Daniel tries to sell the house after I die, Lauren has my permission to challenge the transaction." Daniel stepped backward. "You don't understand." I looked at him. "I understand everything." He said he was only trying to protect the property. I reminded him that he had changed the locks. He said he had done it for security. I reminded him that he had listed the property for sale. He said he had found a buyer because the family needed money. Then he finally said the words that revealed everything. I needed the money. Daniel had accumulated nearly $180,000 in business debt. His company had been failing for months. He had borrowed from credit cards, private lenders, and business partners. He believed the house could solve everything. He told himself that because Mom was dead, the property would eventually be his anyway. He convinced himself that I would not fight him because we were family. And he believed that even if I became angry, I would eventually forgive him. That was his biggest mistake. He had confused my patience with weakness. He had confused my love for Mom with loyalty to him. And he had confused being family with having unlimited access to my life. The legal process began immediately. The fraudulent transfer was challenged. The buyer was informed that Daniel did not have the authority to sell the property. The real estate listing was removed. The house was placed under legal protection while the estate was reviewed. Daniel tried to change his story several times. First, he claimed Mom had verbally promised him the house. Then he claimed she had signed the transfer willingly. Then he said he believed the trust no longer existed. Rebecca responded to each claim with documents. Samuel responded with the trust records. The recording contradicted his version of events. Eventually, Daniel stopped trying to convince us and started trying to convince everyone else. He called relatives and told them I was destroying the family over a misunderstanding. He said I was obsessed with money. He said I didn't care about Mom. He said he had only tried to protect the family home. My Aunt Patricia called me one evening. She told me Daniel was struggling and asked me to let the matter go. "He's your brother," she said. "You only get one family." I listened quietly and then asked her one question. If a stranger had forged Mom's documents and tried to sell her house, would you ask me to forgive him? She became silent. Then I told her, the fact that he is my brother doesn't make what he did less serious. It makes it more painful. I sent her copies of the trust document and the recording. She called me back 20 minutes later. Her voice was completely different. "Lauren, I didn't know." I told her, "That's exactly why I don't want people judging this based on what Daniel tells them." After that, I stopped explaining myself to relatives. Anyone who wanted the truth could speak with Rebecca. Anyone who wanted gossip could speak with Daniel. Daniel's financial problems became worse. Because the attempted sale had been discovered, several of his creditors demanded immediate payment. His business partners withdrew. The company he had built for years collapsed under the weight of debts he had tried to hide. He blamed me for everything. He told relatives that I had ruined his life. But I hadn't ruined anything. I had simply refused to let him use my mother's house as a solution to problems he had created himself. He eventually admitted that he had already planned what he would do with the money from the sale. He would pay off his debts, buy a new car, invest in another business, and keep the rest as an emergency fund. He had never planned to ask me. He had never planned to give me my share. In his mind, the house was already his. Months passed. The legal case finally concluded. The fraudulent transfer was reversed. The house remained jointly protected under the family trust, and Daniel was required to pay legal expenses and damages related to his actions. But the biggest change wasn't financial. It was emotional. Something between Daniel and me had permanently broken. I had spent years believing that if I worked hard enough to keep peace, eventually my family would appreciate it. I had believed that being patient made me a good daughter and sister. But I finally understood that peace built on one person's silence isn't peace. It's surrender. I decided not to sell the house. I renovated it slowly. I kept the blue front door. I kept the oak tree. I restored the flower beds Mom had loved. And I kept the antique clock exactly where it had always been. I placed Mom's photograph beside it. Every time I looked at the clock, I remembered her final words. Check the old clock. At first, I thought she had left me a secret. But eventually I realized she had left me something more valuable than a secret. She had left me the courage to believe my own instincts. Daniel tried to contact me several times. The first message was an apology. The second blamed his financial problems. The third blamed stress. The fourth blamed me. He said I had always been cold toward him. He said Mom would have wanted us to forgive each other. I didn't answer. Eventually he stopped calling. I heard through relatives that he had moved into a small apartment and was working to repay his debts. I didn't celebrate his suffering. I didn't want him destroyed. I simply wanted him to understand that actions have consequences. One morning, nearly a year after Mom's death, I stood alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. Sunlight came through the same window where Mom used to sit every morning. The house was quiet. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I looked at the old clock and thought about everything that had happened. My mother had trusted me enough to protect what she left behind. Daniel had assumed that family meant he could take whatever he wanted. He was wrong. Family can be love, but family can also be the place where boundaries matter most. I used to think justice meant watching someone who hurt you suffer. I don't believe that anymore. Justice for me was simply refusing to lie for someone who had lied to me. It was refusing to surrender because someone called me selfish. It was refusing to let guilt become a weapon. And it was understanding that protecting yourself doesn't make you cruel. Daniel thought he was going to sell our mother's house and walk away with nearly $600,000. He thought I would be too emotional to stop him. He thought the family would pressure me into silence. He thought being my brother would protect him from consequences. But he forgot one thing. My mother knew him better than anyone. She knew what he was capable of. And before she died, she left me the one thing he could never take from me. The truth. I still live near Willow Creek Road. Sometimes I drive past the old house and remember Mom standing in the doorway, waving goodbye as I left. I remember her telling me to drive carefully. I remember the smell of her coffee in the mornings. I remember the sound of her laugh. And I remember the old clock ticking in the background. That clock became more than an antique. It became a reminder. A reminder that secrets eventually come to light. A reminder that documents can expose lies. A reminder that people reveal themselves when they think nobody is watching. And most importantly, a reminder that loving someone does not mean allowing them to destroy you. My brother thought he was stealing a house. But in reality, he was giving me the final reason I needed to stop protecting him. I didn't destroy Daniel. I didn't ruin his life. I didn't take revenge. I simply stopped standing between him and the consequences of his own choices. And that was enough. Because sometimes the strongest revenge isn't taking something from the person who hurt you. Sometimes the strongest revenge is building a peaceful life that they no longer have access to. A life where you don't need their approval. A life where you don't have to explain your boundaries. A life where your mother's final words are no longer a warning, but a reminder. Check the old clock and choose your own road.